My entitled stepsister really thought she won, but 3 hours with a sledgehammer changed everything. I want this room. Why can't I have it? Michaela, my new stepsister, asked, pointing to my bedroom. I laughed, thinking it was a joke. I'd had that room since I was 5. Mom and I hung the butterfly decals together on the walls before she passed. The guest room is next door, I told her. She turned to Dad. Pink's my favorite color, and I really love butterflies. She walked into my bedroom and started running her fingers along my mom's old vanity desk. This would be perfect for my makeup collection. Please? The guest room barely has any closet space, too. She turned to me with the sweetest, fakest smile and said, You can consider it your gift to me. New family, new beginnings. I looked at Dad, waiting for him to say something. Anything. Instead, he pulled me aside and said, Would you mind giving up your room for your new sibling? She really wants it. You know what? If you say yes, I'll let you have the entire garage. You can decorate it, renovate it, bring your mom's things down there. The garage was almost 3 times bigger than my bedroom, and I'd be the only one on the first floor. It was perfect. I grinned and hugged him tight. Deal. Michaela laughed when she heard I got downgraded to the garage and told me to say goodbye to my pink room my mom had painted. I spent 3 months transforming that dusty garage into the room of my dreams. Built-in bookshelves, a reading nook with floor cushions, fairy lights strung between the rafters, a desk overlooking the garden through the new window we installed. I bought a small projector and placed it beside my bed for movie nights, and made a small spot for pictures of me and my mom. All my friends started hanging out there and people bragged about it at school. But when Michaela saw it, her face went dark. She stormed into our parents' room and yelled, She gets an entire studio while I'm stuck in a regular bedroom? She told her mom, This isn't fair. I'm the new sibling. I should get the nice things, right? My stepmom sighed and looked at my dad. Maybe we can switch rooms again? One last time? But this time, Dad didn't cave. She decorated and remodeled that room on her own with her own money. The garage is hers. You get the pink bedroom that you asked for. End of discussion. Michaela began hyperventilating, realizing she'd lost. Then she paused. Fine. Keep your stupid garage. I don't need it. And we thought that was the end of it. But for the next couple of weeks, Michaela became obsessed with improving the pink room, determined to outdo my garage. She bought expensive professional LED strips that synced to music, installed a built-in vanity, placed a mini bar outside her room. And Dad was left with no choice but to fund her ideas with his credit card to keep the peace. But nothing seemed to satisfy her. She'd drag people upstairs to show off her improvements, then storm out when they mentioned they wanted to see the famous garage room. That's when she decided she needed more space for her creative vision. Michaela pretended to be sick and stayed home while me and the parents went out to celebrate my cousin's graduation. She watched from the window as we drove away before taking a sledgehammer up into her room and started hitting the wall between the pink bedroom and the guest bedroom to turn it into one giant room. The wall between the pink and guest room came down exactly like she wanted, for about 3 seconds. Then the ceiling beam, no longer supported, shifted. The neighbors heard a cracking sound shoot through like lightning. Drywall, insulation, and a massive ceiling joist had come crashing down. Michaela had looked up just in time to see it coming but couldn't dive away fast enough. The beam caught her at the base of her skull and pinned her down. She was conscious the whole time, trying to scream for help, but we were hours away from home. Our neighbors eventually called 911, but by then, she'd been trapped for 3 hours. The paramedic said she kept whispering, I can't feel anything, over and over. We showed up at the hospital 6 hours later and sat in the waiting room during the surgery. The doctor stepped out after an hour and confirmed it. Michaela would never move anything below her neck again. She'd need a ventilator to breathe properly. 24-hour care. She was 17 and would never walk or do anything independently again. When she could finally speak through the ventilator apparatus, she asked to see me. I thought she'd want comfort or support. Instead, she whispered, This is your fault. You made me feel like I had to compete for space in my own home. Now I'll never paint my nails again. Never try on clothes. Never hold a phone. I just wanted to belong in the family. Stepmom blamed both me and Dad for what happened, asking, Why couldn't you have just shared your room? Why didn't you offer to help decorate her bedroom when you saw how much she wanted a cool room too? The entire upper floor got sealed off. Michaela moved into the garage because it was the only space large enough for all her medical equipment. I thought that was the end. Until yesterday, an insurance investigator called, saying they found something odd in Michaela's search history, the week before her paralysis. They're reopening the case, and I'm now headed to the police station. The phone rang while I was sitting on the floor next to Michaela's hospital bed in what used to be my garage. The ventilator made its regular whooshing sound every few seconds, and I'd been counting the cycles without really thinking about it. I grabbed my phone and saw a number I didn't recognize. The man on the other end introduced himself as Mateo Huang from the insurance company. His voice sounded careful and professional, like he was reading from a script but trying to sound friendly. He said they'd been doing routine checks on the claim and found something unusual in Michaela's device search history from the week before the accident. My stomach dropped. He explained they were reopening the case and needed me to come to the police station this afternoon to answer some questions. My hands started shaking so badly I almost dropped the phone. I managed to say okay and wrote down the address even though I already knew where the station was. After I hung up, I just sat there staring at Michaela's face. Her eyes were closed and she looked peaceful, which felt wrong given what I'd just heard. I stood up too fast and felt dizzy. I walked into the kitchen where Dad was drinking coffee and Adriana was making toast. I told them about the call. Adriana's face went completely white for about 2 seconds, then her expression changed to angry. She demanded to know what lies I'd told the insurance company, what I'd said to make them suspicious. Her voice got louder with each word. Dad just kept staring at his coffee mug like it had answers written on the bottom. He said we should cooperate fully, give them whatever they need. His voice sounded flat and exhausted, like he'd used up all his energy just getting through the past few weeks. Adriana started to argue, but Dad held up his hand and she stopped. I pulled out my phone and texted my best friend that I might need her later, just in case this went badly. Then I grabbed my jacket from the hook by the door and found my keys in my backpack. I got in my car and started driving toward the police station. The route took me past my old high school, and I remembered how proud I'd felt just a few months ago when I finished the garage renovation. I'd invited all my friends over to see it. The fairy lights reflected off the new window and made everything look magical. Everyone kept saying it was the coolest room they'd ever seen, better than anything on Pinterest or Instagram. They took pictures and posted them with captions about how lucky I was. That pride felt poisonous now, sitting heavy in my chest. Maybe I had been showing off too much. Maybe I pushed Michaela over some invisible edge by having something she wanted so badly. I knew that wasn't logical, but I couldn't stop thinking it. I parked in the police station lot and turned off the engine. Then I just sat there for 5 minutes trying to steady my breathing. My hands were still shaking. I kept thinking about what search history they could have found that would make them reopen the case. I finally made myself get out of the car and walk inside. The waiting area had those uncomfortable plastic chairs and smelled like old coffee and floor cleaner. I sat down and forced myself to remember the actual collapse day. We'd left at noon for my cousin's graduation ceremony. Michaela had claimed she had a headache and wanted to stay home. I remembered her standing at her bedroom window watching us pack the car. We got the neighbor's frantic call around 4 p.m. They said they'd heard a huge cracking sound and saw dust coming from our upstairs windows. The paramedics told us later that Michaela had been trapped for at least 3 hours by the time they got there. She was conscious and terrified the whole time, unable to move or call for help. My stomach turned thinking about those 3 hours. What she must have felt lying there knowing something was horribly wrong with her body. The waiting room clock said 2:15 p.m., and I wondered how long I'd have to wait. A woman came out about 10 minutes later and walked straight toward me. She introduced herself as Detective Leilani Santos and shook my hand firmly. Her eyes looked kind but serious. She led me down a hallway to a small interview room that smelled like old coffee and cleaning solution. The table was metal and cold when I accidentally touched it. She pulled out a chair for me and then sat across the table. She explained this was just an informational interview, that I wasn't under arrest or being accused of anything. She said I had the right to have a parent or attorney present if I wanted one. I told her I'd answer questions on my own because I had nothing to hide. That was true. I didn't know what they'd found, but I knew I hadn't done anything wrong. Detective Santos pulled out a notebook and asked me to describe the family dynamics before the accident. I tried to explain how Adriana always took Michaela's side in every argument or disagreement. How Dad tried to keep peace by giving in to whatever Michaela wanted, even when it wasn't fair. How I felt squeezed out of my own family after they got married. My voice cracked when I mentioned my mom's butterfly decals that she and I had put up together when I was little. Michaela had covered them all up with her expensive LED strips that synced to music. The detective took notes without any expression on her face, just nodding occasionally. She asked specific questions about when things started getting worse between me and Michaela. I explained about the garage trade and how Michaela got angrier after she saw how nice I'd made it. Then she asked about the garage renovation costs and timeline. I explained I'd saved money from my part-time job at the library, about 8 months of paychecks. I bought the materials myself at Home Depot and did most of the decorating alone. Dad helped with the window installation on weekends because that required actual construction work. The detective wrote something down and then asked if we got permits for the window. My chest tightened because I honestly didn't know. I told her Dad handled that part, or at least I thought he did. I'd assumed he took care of all the official stuff while I focused on making it look nice. She made another note and I felt my anxiety spike. Detective Santos pulled out her tablet and turned it toward me. She showed me a preliminary report from Mateo Huang, the insurance investigator. She explained that routine device forensics revealed search history that raised red flags. She said insurance companies always check devices in major structural damage claims to rule out fraud. I nodded, even though I didn't really understand why this mattered for Michaela's accident. She seemed like she'd just made a stupid mistake trying to knock down a wall. The detective turned the tablet more directly toward me and showed me a list of search terms from Michaela's laptop. The searches were dated 5 days before the collapse. My eyes scanned down the list and my blood went cold. How to know if wall is load-bearing. Sledgehammer demolition interior wall. Can you knock down wall between 2 bedrooms? Home renovation without contractor. Each search term felt like a punch. She asked if I knew Michaela was planning any construction projects. I shook my head, and the room felt like it was spinning a little. I explained that Michaela never mentioned wanting to actually demolish walls. She just kept buying decorations and complaining that her room wasn't big enough to compete with mine. Detective Santos asked me to walk through the day of the accident again, specifically what time we left and who knew we'd be gone. I told her we left around noon for the graduation party. Michaela definitely knew because she'd watched us pack the car from her bedroom window. I remembered her face in the glass looking pale and unhappy. I thought at the time she was just mad about missing the party, but now I wondered if she was nervous about what she was planning to do. Detective Santos shifted in her chair and pulled up a new screen on her tablet. She asked if I hired any contractors for the garage renovation, or if I did all the work myself. I explained that I bought the materials and did most of the decorating, painting the walls and installing the shelves and fairy lights on my own. Dad helped with the window because that needed actual construction work, cutting through the wall and framing it properly. She nodded and wrote something down, then asked who did the electrical work for all the lights and the projector outlet. I said Dad handled that part too, running new wiring from the house's main electrical panel. The detective looked up and asked directly if we got building permits for any of this work. My stomach dropped because I honestly didn't know. I told her Dad said he would handle all the official stuff, the permits and inspections and whatever else was needed. I focused on making it look nice while he dealt with the legal requirements. Or at least that's what I thought he was doing. She made more notes on her tablet and said the insurance company would need to verify that all the work was done legally and up to code. I felt sweat forming on my palms because I suddenly wasn't sure Dad had actually gotten permits. He might have just said that to make me feel better about the renovation. Detective Santos closed that screen and opened another one, asking if Michaela ever threatened to damage my garage or said anything about wanting to destroy it. I shook my head and said no, nothing like that. She just made comments constantly about how unfair the room situation was, how I got this huge space while she was stuck in a regular bedroom. There weren't any physical fights between us, just the usual step-sibling tension and her passive-aggressive remarks whenever her friends came over. The detective asked if Adriana ever suggested that Michaela should get the garage instead of me. I hesitated because I didn't want to throw Adriana under the bus, but the detective was waiting for an answer. I admitted that Adriana made comments pretty often about me having too much space, saying things like it wasn't fair that one kid got an entire studio apartment while her daughter had to squeeze everything into a normal bedroom. She never directly said Michaela should take the garage from me, but she definitely implied that I was being selfish by keeping such a big space to myself. The detective's voice got quieter, and she asked me to describe exactly what Michaela said at the hospital when she accused me. I took a breath and repeated what I remembered. How Michaela said it was my fault for making her feel like she had to compete for space in her own home. She said I made her feel worthless and invisible, that she just wanted to belong in the family but I had to have the coolest room and all the attention. My voice started shaking as I talked because part of me genuinely wondered if she was right, if I had been showing off too much with the garage and pushed her into doing something desperate. Detective Santos asked gently if I believed I caused the accident. I said I didn't know anymore, that everyone kept saying if I had just shared my room or helped Michaela decorate hers then none of this would have happened. Maybe they were right. Maybe I was selfish and this was partly my fault for not being a better sister. Detective Santos closed her tablet and set it on the table between us. She explained that depending on what the full investigation revealed, there could be several legal issues around the demolition. If Michaela intended to cause damage to the house, that could be one thing. If the renovation work on my garage was done without permits, that was a code violation. If anyone else was involved in planning the demolition or knew about it beforehand, that opened other questions. She said insurance fraud was a serious crime when someone deliberately damages property to collect insurance money. Reckless endangerment was also serious, even if Michaela only endangered herself by knocking down a load-bearing wall. My mouth went completely dry as I realized she was talking about criminal charges. I asked if Michaela could go to jail, and the detective said probably not given her current condition, but there could be fines and legal consequences for the family. Dad could face charges if the garage work was done illegally. Adriana could face issues if she knew about or encouraged the demolition plan. The detective asked if I would consent to having my phone and laptop examined by their tech team. She said they needed to verify that I had no knowledge of Michaela's plans, that I wasn't involved in any way. I agreed immediately, unlocking my phone right there and sliding it across the table. I gave her my laptop password too, desperate to prove I didn't know anything about what Michaela was planning. Detective Santos thanked me and said a tech specialist would make copies of everything and return my devices within 48 hours. She stood up and shook my hand again, saying I was free to go, and they would be in touch if they had more questions. I grabbed my keys and walked out of the interview room, my legs feeling shaky and weird. I left the police station at 6 p.m., hands still trembling as I unlocked my car. I sat in the driver's seat for a few minutes just breathing, trying to process everything the detective had said about permits and fraud and criminal charges. I pulled out my phone and texted Dad that the interview was done, but it had been really intense. He responded an hour later with just okay, and nothing else. No questions about what they asked or how I was feeling. I drove home and pulled into our driveway, then sat there for another 20 minutes watching the garage lights glow through the window. The space that used to make me so proud now felt like evidence of something wrong, like maybe I shouldn't have made it so nice. I finally forced myself to get out of the car and go inside. The next morning I was pouring cereal in the kitchen when I heard Dad's phone ring. He answered, and I watched his face change from confused to completely pale as he listened to whoever was calling. After he hung up, he told me and Adriana to sit down at the table. Mateo Huang, the insurance investigator, had found more searches on Michaela's phone from the week before the accident. Dad's voice was flat as he read from the notes he'd taken during the call. Michaela had searched, how long does insurance claim take? And, does homeowner's insurance cover accidental demolition? And, what happens if you damage house without permit? Adriana started crying immediately, saying Michaela couldn't have understood what those searches meant. She was just a kid researching random things. But I could see in Dad's face that he knew what I knew, that Michaela had been planning this and thinking about the insurance angle. Later that morning, Mateo sent a follow-up email with more details from the forensics report. Dad opened it on his laptop and we all crowded around to read. Michaela had also searched, can you get in trouble for knocking down wrong wall, and structural damage insurance payout average, 2 days before the accident. The timeline made it clear that she knew there was risk involved, but researched whether insurance would cover any damage that happened. I felt sick reading it, this evidence that Michaela had actually thought through the consequences, and gambled that Dad's insurance would fix whatever went wrong. She didn't just impulsively grab a sledgehammer, she planned it and calculated that insurance would bail her out if things went bad. The investigator's report included another set of searches from the morning of the accident itself, the day we left for my cousin's graduation. Michaela had looked up how to fake being sick convincingly and best excuses to skip family event that same morning before telling us she had a headache. Dad read this part out loud and Adriana sobbed even harder because it proved Michaela had planned to stay home alone specifically to do the demolition. She had faked being sick so we would leave without her, and she could knock down the wall in private. I sat down heavily in one of the kitchen chairs, feeling the premeditation of it all settle over me like weight. This wasn't a stupid impulsive mistake. It was calculated and planned, and somehow that made everything feel so much worse. I spent the afternoon sitting in my car in the library parking lot where I used to work before everything happened. I needed to get away from the house and think through my feelings without Dad and Adriana around. Yes, Michaela had planned this whole thing, researched it, prepared for it. But she was also 17 and stupid, and probably genuinely thought she would just knock down a wall and have a bigger, cooler room by the time we got home. She must have pictured us walking in and being impressed, or at least accepting that it was already done. She didn't plan to become paralyzed, didn't plan for the ceiling to collapse on her. I kept trying to figure out if knowing she planned it made it better or worse, and I honestly couldn't decide. My phone buzzed around 7 that evening while I was still sitting in the parking lot, and Detective Santos's name lit up the screen. I answered and she got straight to it, saying the neighbors had given another statement about something they remembered from 2 days before the accident. A delivery truck had dropped off a package at our house, and the neighbor watched Michaela sign for it herself through their kitchen window. Detective Santos asked if Dad had ordered anything recently, and I put her on speaker so I could drive home while we talked. When I got back, Dad was in the kitchen, and I told him about the call. He pulled up his order history on his laptop and scrolled through everything from the past month, shaking his head. No sledgehammer, no tools, nothing heavy delivered to the house. Detective Santos said this lined up with what they suspected, that Michaela had ordered the sledgehammer herself using someone else's account or card, planning the whole demolition days in advance. The detective explained that the neighbor's statement was important because it showed clear preparation, not some sudden angry impulse. Michaela had time to think about what she was doing, time to stop, but she went through with ordering the tool and waiting for it to arrive. The same neighbor also told police about the sounds they heard the day everything happened. Detective Santos read from her notes, explaining how the neighbor was doing dishes around 1 in the afternoon when they heard music start playing upstairs at our house, loud enough to hear through the walls. At first they thought Michaela was just being a teenager, blasting music while we were gone. Then around 1:30, they started hearing rhythmic pounding mixed in with the music, like someone hammering or hitting something hard. The neighbor said they almost went over to check, but figured Michaela was maybe hanging pictures or doing some kind of craft project. The pounding went on for over 2 hours, stopping and starting, and the neighbor got used to the sound. Then at 3:30, they heard this massive cracking noise that made their whole house shake, followed by a huge crash, and then silence. That's when they knew something was seriously wrong, and called 911. I sat there imagining Michaela swinging that sledgehammer for hours, probably taking breaks when her arms got tired, then starting up again. My throat felt tight thinking about how someone could have stopped her if they'd just knocked on the door, if the neighbor had trusted their gut and checked on the noise. But nobody did, and she kept going until the ceiling came down on her. 2 days after that call, Detective Santos contacted us again with more information from the bank records. Adriana had given permission for them to look at her credit card statements, probably thinking it would clear things up. Instead, they found that Adriana's card was used to buy the vanity, the LED strips, and the sledgehammer, all from the same hardware store over a 3-week period. The detective came to the house to talk to us about it, and Adriana's face went white when she saw the printed statements. She insisted she never approved buying a sledgehammer, that she only knew about the vanity and lights because Michaela showed her the purchases after they arrived. Adriana said Michaela must have taken her card from her purse and used it without asking, which was possible since they lived in the same house. But Dad looked at Adriana differently after hearing this, his eyes narrowed and his jaw tight. I could see him doing the math in his head, wondering how much Adriana actually knew, and how much she was pretending not to know. The detective said the credit card records supported the theory that this was planned over weeks, not days, with Michaela gathering everything she needed piece by piece. Then Detective Santos pulled out her tablet and showed us something else they'd found during the investigation. Text messages between Adriana and Michaela from 8 days before the accident, pulled from Michaela's phone backup. Adriana had written to Michaela saying you need to make it impossible for them to ignore how unfair this is. And Michaela responded, I have a plan. There were more messages in the thread, with Adriana writing about how I got everything I wanted, while Michaela got stuck with leftovers. Michaela had sent back a bunch of room design screenshots with captions like, this is what I deserve and why does she get the cool space? Adriana's face fell apart as she read her own words on the detective's screen and she started crying, saying she only meant Michaela should decorate more and make her room really nice, not tear down walls. Detective Santos said calmly that the text showed a pattern of encouraging Michaela to escalate the situation, even if Adriana didn't know the specific plan. The messages created an environment where Michaela felt justified in taking extreme action because her mom kept telling her she deserved more. Sitting there listening to all this, I started remembering things differently, seeing them through a new lens. Adriana had pushed Dad constantly to fund Michaela's room improvements, saying things like she needs to feel equal in this family, and you can't let one daughter have everything while the other has nothing. At the time, I thought she was just being a protective mom, standing up for her kid who felt left out. But now I could see how she fed Michaela's anger and made it grow bigger, validating every complaint and making it seem like I was the enemy. Adriana never once suggested that Michaela should be grateful for having a nice room at all, or that maybe comparing ourselves constantly was unhealthy. Instead, she kept pointing out everything I had that Michaela didn't, keeping score like we were in some kind of competition. I felt this flash of real anger at her, hot and sharp in my chest, because she helped create this whole disaster by telling Michaela she was right to feel cheated. On day 4 of the investigation, a woman named Heidi Klein showed up at our house with a clipboard and a serious expression. She introduced herself as a structural engineer hired by the insurance company to assess the damage and figure out exactly what happened. Dad let her in, and she went straight upstairs to the sealed-off area, spending the next 3 hours up there. I could hear her walking around, taking measurements and occasionally talking into a voice recorder. When she finally came back downstairs, her face looked grim, and she asked if we could all sit down in the living room. She spread out some photos on the coffee table showing the collapsed ceiling and the demolished wall, then pointed at the photos while she talked. The wall Michaela knocked down was absolutely load-bearing, meaning it was critical for supporting the second-floor ceiling joists. Without that wall, the whole structure above it had nothing to hold it up. Heidi explained that our house was built in 1987 with a specific structural design where certain walls carried the weight of the roof and second floor. She pulled out the original building plans she'd gotten from the city and showed us how the wall between the pink bedroom and guest room was marked as structural, not decorative. Removing that wall without putting in proper support beams first meant the ceiling beam had to carry way too much weight and it shifted and collapsed within hours. She asked Dad if he'd gotten any permits for alterations upstairs, and Dad's face flushed red as he admitted he didn't think permits were needed for interior cosmetic changes like paint and decorations. Heidi said firmly that demolishing any wall, especially a load-bearing one, absolutely required permits and inspections before the work started. Doing it without approval was a serious code violation that put everyone in the house at risk. Then the engineer walked through the first floor and stopped in my garage space, looking around carefully. She paused at my window, the one Dad and I had installed so I could see the garden, and asked when we put it in, and whether we got a permit for it. Dad's face went from red to purple, and he stammered that he didn't get a permit. Thought the window was small enough that we didn't need one. Heidi wrote something down on her clipboard and explained that adding any opening to an exterior wall required a permit because it affected the building envelope and could cause structural or moisture problems if done wrong. She said the city would likely require us to get permits for both violations now, the demolished wall upstairs and the unpermitted window down here, plus we'd face fines for doing work without approval. Dad just nodded, looking defeated, while I felt sick thinking about how much this was all going to cost. A few days later, another visitor showed up, this time a social worker from the hospital named Royce Booker. He'd been assigned to follow up on Michaela's home care situation and make sure we had what we needed. Royce was probably in his 40s, with kind eyes and a calm way of moving through the garage space without making it feel crowded. He spent about an hour reviewing all of Michaela's equipment, the ventilator humming in the corner, the feeding tube supplies stacked on shelves, the adjustable bed taking up most of the room. He asked questions about our daily routine, who was doing what care tasks, how we were managing overnight. Then he sat down with all 3 of us and said gently that this arrangement wasn't sustainable long-term, without professional nursing support. Adriana's voice went sharp and defensive, snapping that we were doing our best with no help and no money. Royce held up his hands and said calmly that he understood. That's exactly why he was here, to connect us with resources and support services we qualified for. After Royce left, Adriana stayed in the kitchen instead of going back to check on Michaela. I was getting a glass of water when I heard her start crying, these big gasping sobs that sounded like they were ripping out of her. She leaned against the counter and said through tears that she'd lost her beautiful upstairs bedroom, and now lived in a house that felt like a hospital, with machines beeping all day and night. Then she looked right at me with red, swollen eyes and said the garage was supposed to be my punishment for being selfish, a way to teach me that I couldn't always get what I wanted. But instead, it became Michaela's prison, the only room big enough for all her equipment, and now her daughter would spend the rest of her life trapped in the space that was meant to humble me. I stood there holding my water glass, not knowing if I should say something comforting or just walk away, feeling this weird mix of sympathy and anger that she was still somehow making this about punishing me. I walked away without saying anything and went to my temporary sleeping space in the den, feeling this weird heavy pressure in my chest that made it hard to breathe normally. My phone buzzed around 11 p.m. with Royce's name on the screen, and I answered while staring at the ceiling in the dark. He asked how I was handling everything, his voice quiet and careful, and I found myself admitting that everyone seemed to think this was my fault for not just sharing my room from the start. The words came out faster than I meant them to, telling him how Adriana kept saying I should have helped Michaela decorate, how even Dad looked at me sometimes like maybe I could have prevented this. Royce let me finish before saying gently that Michaela made her own choices, that I was allowed to feel hurt by being made into the scapegoat. Something about hearing that from someone outside the family made my throat tight, and I had to swallow hard before I could thank him and hang up. The next morning, Detective Santos called Dad's phone and asked us all to sit down because she had another finding. We gathered in the living room, Adriana perched on the edge of the couch looking defensive before the detective even started talking. Santos explained that Michaela's phone had a draft Instagram post dated the morning of the accident, and she read the caption out loud. Room transformation reveal coming today, with a bunch of hashtags about home renovation and room makeovers. The detective said Michaela had planned to film the whole demolition and post it as a dramatic before and after story. I felt my stomach drop thinking about Michaela setting up her phone to record, expecting to show off some amazing renovation instead of ending up paralyzed. Adriana made a choking sound and covered her mouth with both hands. Detective Santos pulled up something else on her tablet and said the draft post included a video script that Michaela had written out. She read it to us in a flat, professional voice. If something breaks, my dad's insurance will totally fix it, so why not go big? The detective explained this showed Michaela's magical thinking about insurance, how she genuinely believed it would cover any damage without real consequences. I sat there feeling this weird mix of being angry at how stupid Michaela had been, and sad that she really thought this would work out fine. Dad's face had gone pale, and he kept shaking his head slowly like he couldn't process what he was hearing. Adriana started crying again, these quiet tears running down her face while she stared at the floor. Then Detective Santos turned to Adriana and said the text messages showed something else important. She explained that when Michaela expressed doubts about the plan in their texts, Adriana had written back that Dad's insurance was really good and she shouldn't worry so much. Adriana's head snapped up and she protested that she didn't know Michaela was planning to demolish anything, that she thought they were just talking about decorating ideas. But the detective said calmly that the text created an environment where Michaela felt protected from consequences, where she believed insurance would magically fix whatever went wrong. Dad turned to look at Adriana with this expression I'd never seen before, like he was really seeing her clearly for the first time and didn't like what he saw. The room went quiet except for the sound of Michaela's ventilator humming from the garage. After Detective Santos left, Dad walked out to his car and just sat there. I watched him through the window for a while before going back to my homework, and when I checked again an hour later, he was still sitting in the driver's seat staring at nothing. Adriana had gone to check on Michaela, and I was alone in the house feeling like everything was falling apart in slow motion. Dad finally came inside after dark, and when I asked if he was okay, he just said he couldn't process everything right now and needed to sleep. His voice sounded flat and dead, and I recognized this as the same shutdown mode he went into after Mom died, where he just stopped functioning until the crisis passed enough for him to move again. At the school the next day, I noticed my friend group had shrunk down to just 2 people who still sat with me at lunch. Everyone else found reasons to be busy or just walked past without making eye contact. I heard whispers in the hallway between classes, people talking about the paralyzed stepsister and the garage room drama. Someone had spray-painted garage influencer on my locker in silver paint, and I had to get the janitor to help me scrub it off while other students walked by staring. I ended up eating lunch in my car for the rest of the week, sitting in the parking lot with a sandwich I couldn't really taste. I seriously started looking up information about transferring to a different school for senior year, thinking maybe I could start over somewhere nobody knew about any of this. A week after the big meeting with Detective Santos, the neighbors gave another statement to the police. Dad got a call asking him to come down to the station, and when he came back his face was gray and tired. He told us the neighbors had seen Adriana carrying paint samples and measuring tape upstairs 3 days before the accident, talking with Michaela about making the space work better. Detective Santos had asked Adriana about this, and Adriana admitted she was helping Michaela plan the layout for a combined room, but swore she didn't know about the demolition plan. Dad repeated the detective's words about how the pattern of enabling was becoming impossible to deny, and Adriana stood up and walked out of the room without responding. 2 days later, Mateo Huang from the insurance company called while we were eating dinner. Dad put him on speaker, and Mateo's voice filled the kitchen, careful and formal. He said the insurance company was likely denying the structural damage claim because the demolition was intentional and the work had been done illegally without permits. The policy didn't cover damage caused deliberately by household members, even if the person didn't understand the full consequences. Dad's face went gray as he asked questions about appeals and exceptions, but Mateo just kept explaining the policy language in his calm, professional voice. I watched Dad's hands start shaking as he wrote down notes, his handwriting getting messier as the call went on. The insurance company sent an official letter the next morning confirming they would continue covering Michaela's medical care and equipment under the health policy, but the home repair costs were our responsibility. Mateo called again to walk through the numbers, estimating we were looking at $75,000 to $100,000 to properly repair the upstairs structure, plus city fines for the unpermitted work. Dad sat down hard in his chair and put his head in his hands, his shoulders hunched forward like he was trying to make himself smaller. Adriana started asking questions about payment plans and loans, her voice getting higher and more panicked with each sentence. I excused myself and went to my temporary sleeping space, closing the door on their voices. That night, I lay awake in the den, staring at the ceiling and thinking about all the times Adriana had pressured Dad to let Michaela have the garage. I remembered her saying things like, "You're choosing your daughter over my daughter," making it sound like Dad was being unfair by letting me keep the space I'd renovated. I wondered if I should tell Detective Santos about those conversations, add them to the pile of evidence showing how Adriana had pushed and enabled and created this whole disaster. But I also didn't want to make things worse. Didn't want to be the one who caused even more problems for a family that was already falling apart. I kept going back and forth in my head, trying to figure out if staying quiet was protecting people who had blamed me for everything, or if speaking up was just revenge disguised as honesty. The next morning, Detective Santos called asking us to come back to the station. Dad and Adriana rode together while I drove separately, my hands gripping the steering wheel too tight the whole way. We sat in the same interview room, and Detective Santos pulled out her tablet again, her face serious. She said they found more messages on Adriana's phone, these ones to her sister from 2 weeks before the accident. She turned the screen so we could all see. The first message from Adriana said Michaela needs to do something dramatic to make them see how unfair this is, a big gesture that forces change. Her sister wrote back, "Be careful what you encourage." Adriana's response made my stomach drop. Sometimes you have to shake things up to get results. I felt sick reading it, but also weirdly relieved because here was proof in black and white that Adriana had pushed this whole thing. Dad's face went pale and he looked at Adriana like he didn't recognize her. Adriana started crying and saying she didn't mean Michaela should destroy anything. She just wanted her to speak up more. Detective Santos let her finish, then explained that while the messages were bad, Proving criminal intent for insurance fraud or contributing to delinquency of a minor meant showing Adriana knew about the specific demolition plan. The texts showed bad judgment and enabling behavior, but probably not enough for criminal charges. She said the burden of proof was really high and prosecutors were unlikely to file charges against a mother whose daughter was now paralyzed. The detective's voice was kind, but firm when she said this, like she wanted us to understand the legal reality, even if it felt unfair. Dad asked if that meant Adriana wouldn't face any consequences, and Detective Santos said the consequences were already happening, just not criminal ones. We drove home in silence, and I went straight to my temporary room in the den. 2 days later, a man knocked on our door holding a clipboard and introduced himself as Anders McKay from the city building department. He said he was here to inspect the property following the structural collapse report. Dad let him in, and Anders spent an hour upstairs examining the sealed-off area, taking photos and making notes. When he came back down, he handed Dad a violation notice listing unpermitted demolition upstairs and unpermitted window installation in the garage. He went through each violation carefully, explaining that any wall removal required permits and inspections, and adding a window to an exterior wall needed approval too. He outlined a plan where we had to hire a licensed contractor, get proper permits, and bring everything up to code. The fine started at $2,500 and would increase if we didn't begin fixing things within 30 days. Dad's hand shook as he signed the notice, and Anders said he was sorry, but the city had to enforce the codes. After he left, Dad sat at the kitchen table staring at the violation notice, and I could see him doing math in his head about how much this was all going to cost. Adriana came downstairs and asked what happened, and when Dad showed her the notice, she started crying again, saying they couldn't afford any of this. I went back to my room because I couldn't handle watching them fall apart. The next afternoon, Royce Booker came back, the social worker from the hospital. He brought a thick folder of paperwork and sat down with all of us in the living room. He said he put together a care plan proposal that would make things easier for everyone. The plan included 12 hours per day of in-home nursing care covered by Medicaid, from 8 in the morning to 8 at night. He explained that family members would need to handle the remaining shifts overnight, but he'd set up training so we knew what to do. Royce went through the details of what Adriana and Dad would need to learn, things like ventilator management, feeding tube care, and how to position Michaela to prevent bed sores. He said the training started next week and required 40 hours of classroom work plus practical sessions. Dad took notes while Royce talked, asking questions about schedules and what happened if someone got sick. Adriana sat quiet the whole time, not asking anything. Royce left copies of all the paperwork and said he'd call in a few days to confirm the training schedule. Dad and I showed up at the hospital the following Tuesday for the first caregiver training session. Adriana was supposed to come, but called that morning saying she felt sick. The instructor was a nurse who'd worked with ventilator patients for 20 years. She had us practice on mannequins first, showing us how to suction Michaela's breathing tube when secretions built up. My hands felt clumsy holding the suction catheter, and I kept worrying I'd hurt someone if I did it wrong. Dad's hands shook the whole time, but he kept trying, asking the instructor to show him again when he messed up. We learned how to check the ventilator settings, what the alarms meant, and how to respond if something went wrong. The instructor made us practice each skill until we could do it without thinking, and by the end of the 3-hour session, my back ached from bending over the mannequin. Dad thanked the instructor and asked when the next session was, writing down the date in his phone. Walking out to the parking lot, I felt exhausted, and we still had 3 more sessions to go. Detective Santos was waiting by my car in the parking lot. She said she wanted to catch me alone for a minute. Her voice was quiet when she suggested I start keeping track of any concerning interactions at home, just in case. She didn't say in case of what, but I understood she was worried about Adriana's blame patterns getting worse. I nodded and said I would. That night, I opened a new note on my phone and titled it Journal, adding the date to the first entry. I wrote down what Adriana had said that morning about being too sick for training and how she'd blamed me again yesterday for making Michaela feel competitive. It felt weird documenting my own family like they were suspects, but Detective Santos wouldn't have suggested it without a reason. 3 nights later, I woke up to Michaela's ventilator alarm beeping. I got up and went to the garage, my eyes adjusting to the dim glow of the medical equipment. Michaela was awake, her eyes tracking me as I came closer. I checked the ventilator display and saw it was just a position alarm, nothing serious. Through the speaking valve, she whispered that she didn't think the ceiling could actually fall. She said she just wanted a bigger room like mine, that she thought Dad's insurance would fix any small problems. Then her face changed and got hard, and she said if I hadn't made such a big deal about the garage, she wouldn't have felt so desperate to compete. I didn't argue or defend myself, just adjusted her pillow and reset the alarm. Her eyes followed me as I moved around the bed, and I wondered if she actually believed what she was saying, or if it was just easier than accepting the truth. Walking back to the den, I thought about what Michaela had said. I realized her blame was the only way she could cope with being trapped in a body that didn't work anymore. She couldn't accept that her own choices did this because that would mean she destroyed her own life for nothing. It was easier to make it my fault, to have someone to be angry at instead of drowning in regret. I felt a weird mix of compassion and frustration, understanding why she needed a target, but hating that I was it. I added this to my journal entry, noting the time and what she'd said. 3 weeks after my first police interview, Dad finally agreed to meet with a family attorney. Her name was Serafina Calderon, and her office was in a tall building downtown with big windows overlooking the city. We sat in her conference room and she spent an hour reading through all the evidence we brought, the text messages, the violation notices, the insurance denial letter. When she finished, she looked up and told us straight out that criminal charges were unlikely. She said no prosecutor wanted to charge a paralyzed teenager or her grieving mother. The optics were terrible. However, she continued, we should expect the insurance denial to stand. the city fines to proceed, and possibly Child Protective Services getting involved for family support services. Dad asked about appeals, and Serafina said we could try, but the insurance policy language was clear about intentional damage. She started explaining our options for the city violations and how to work with CPS if they showed up. I made a decision right then and interrupted Serafina. I told her everything about Adriana's pressure tactics, how she'd pushed Dad to give Michaela the garage, how she'd enabled every escalating demand Michaela made. Dad looked uncomfortable, but he didn't stop me from talking. I explained the pattern of Adriana making Dad feel guilty for having boundaries, how she'd funded all of Michaela's expensive room improvements while complaining that I had too much space. Serafina took notes and said this context was important for understanding the family dynamics, even if it didn't change the legal outcome. She suggested family mediation once the immediate crisis stabilized, saying we needed a neutral third party to help work through all the blame and resentment. Dad agreed to think about it, and we scheduled another meeting for 2 weeks later. Driving home, I felt lighter somehow. Like saying everything out loud to someone official made it more real and less like I was going crazy. 3 days later, Detective Santos called while I was making lunch and asked if we could all come in Friday at 2 p.m. for a final meeting about the investigation. She explained that representatives from the insurance company, city building department, and social services would be there to present their findings and recommendations. Her voice was calm but official, like she was checking items off a list. I told her we'd be there and hung up feeling weird, like this was the last chapter of something, but I didn't know if it ended well or badly. Dad took the day off work for the meeting and we drove to the police station in silence, Adriana sitting in the back seat staring out the window. The conference room was bigger than the interview room, with a long table and too many chairs. Detective Santos sat at the head with her tablet and folders spread out in front of her. Mateo from the insurance company sat on one side wearing a dark suit, and Anders from the city building department sat across from him with a clipboard. Royce came in last carrying a leather bag and gave me a small nod before sitting down. Detective Santos started by thanking everyone for coming and said she wanted to walk through the complete timeline of events so everyone understood what happened and why. She pulled up her tablet and turned it toward us, showing a chart with dates and search terms. She explained that 5 days before the collapse, Michaela searched for information about load-bearing walls and sledgehammer demolition. Then 2 days later, she researched insurance coverage for accidental damage. The morning of the collapse, she searched how to fake being sick convincingly. Detective Santos spoke in a steady voice, just presenting facts without judgment, but each detail felt like a weight dropping on my chest. She showed the neighbor's statement about the sledgehammer delivery and the timeline of the demolition itself, how Michaela spent over 2 hours hitting the wall before it came down. Then she pulled up the text messages between Adriana and Michaela, the ones where Adriana wrote about making it impossible to ignore how unfair things were, and told Michaela not to worry about insurance. Adriana sat completely still next to Dad, her hands folded on the table, not looking at the screen. Dad pulled out a pen and started taking notes on a legal pad, his hand shaking enough that his writing came out wobbly. Mateo spoke next and explained that based on the evidence of intentional demolition and unpermitted work, the insurance company was denying the structural damage claim. He said the policy clearly excluded coverage for damage caused deliberately by household members, even if the person didn't fully understand the consequences. His voice was matter of fact, not mean, but not sympathetic either, just explaining business decisions. Anders went through the city violations, listing the unpermitted demolition upstairs and the unpermitted window installation in the garage. He said we'd need to hire a licensed contractor, get proper permits, and bring everything up to code within 90 days. The fines totaled $4,000 plus the cost of remediation, and he handed Dad a packet of forms that needed to be filled out. I watched Dad's pen move across his notepad, writing down numbers and dates like he was trying to solve a math problem. Detective Santos cleared her throat and said that after reviewing all the evidence, the police department was not recommending criminal charges against anyone. She explained that Michaela's actions were definitely reckless and showed poor judgment, but she was already facing life-changing consequences that were more severe than any criminal penalty. The detective said there wasn't enough evidence that Adriana knew about the specific demolition plan, just that she encouraged Michaela's general escalation. Mateo confirmed that the medical coverage would continue under the health insurance policy, so all of Michaela's care and equipment would still be covered. Anders added that as long as we started the remediation process within 30 days, the city wouldn't pursue additional penalties. I felt this strange mix of relief and disappointment, like I wanted someone to be punished, but also didn't want things to get worse. Royce set his bag on the table and said he needed to address something based on what the investigation revealed about our family situation. He explained that he was referring us to Child Protective Services for voluntary support services, not as punishment, but to make sure everyone had access to counseling and help working through everything. He said CPS could connect us with family therapists, support groups, and resources for managing the stress of caring for someone with Michaela's needs. Adriana's face crumpled and she started crying, her shoulders shaking as she covered her mouth with both hands. She said through tears that she never wanted any of this. She just wanted her daughter to be happy and feel like she belonged in the family. Detective Santos reached across the table and handed Adriana a box of tissues, saying quietly that she understood this was hard for everyone. Dad put his hand on Adriana's shoulder, but she shrugged it off, still crying into the tissues. The meeting wrapped up with everyone handing Dad copies of their reports and forms, stacking papers in front of him until there was a small pile. We stood up to leave and I grabbed my jacket from the back of my chair, ready to get out of that room and back to normal air. Walking through the parking lot toward our car, Adriana suddenly grabbed my arm and spun me around. She started yelling that this was still my fault for being selfish and showing off with the garage, that I made Michaela feel so worthless she did something desperate. Her voice was loud enough that people getting into their cars nearby turned to look. I stood there frozen as she kept going, saying I could have just shared my room from the start, that I could have helped Michaela decorate instead of making everything a competition. Then her voice broke and she started sobbing, saying she was terrified of losing Michaela, that watching her daughter trapped in a body that didn't work was killing her. She said she couldn't handle the guilt of encouraging Michaela, that she didn't know how to fix any of this or make it better. Tears ran down her face and she kept saying she was sorry, but I didn't know if she was apologizing to me or to Michaela or to herself. I just stood there awkwardly with my arms at my sides, not knowing if I should hug her or back away. Dad came over and gently took Adriana's elbow, guiding her toward the car while she cried. He looked back at me once with this exhausted expression, like he was carrying something too heavy but couldn't put it down. That evening, after we got home and ate a quiet dinner, Dad called me and Adriana into the living room for a family meeting. He said he was taking a leave of absence from work starting next week, so he could focus on the remediation project and get trained as Michaela's caregiver. He'd already contacted a contractor about the upstairs repairs and set up a payment plan with the city for the fines. His voice was steady and clear, not shaky or uncertain like it had been for weeks. He sounded like someone who finally had a plan, like having concrete tasks to complete gave him something solid to hold on to. He showed us the contractor's estimate and the timeline for getting permits, walking us through each step like he was presenting a project at work. Adriana nodded along, wiping her eyes with a crumpled tissue. I listened and felt this weird sense of relief that Dad was actually handling things instead of just shutting down. I took a breath and told Dad and Adriana clearly that I would help with Michaela's care and cooperate with the house repairs, but I wasn't going to be the only caregiver or the family's punching bag anymore. I said I needed them to acknowledge that I didn't cause this, that Michaela made her own choices and the consequences were hers to live with. My voice stayed calm but firm, like I was drawing a line in the sand. I told them I'd do my part, but I also had school and college applications and my own life to think about. Dad nodded slowly, looking down at his hands. Adriana looked away toward the window, but didn't argue or protest, just sat there quietly. It wasn't a big emotional moment or a breakthrough, just a simple statement of boundaries that needed to be said. 2 days later, Royce came back with the nursing schedule printed out on official letterhead. He explained that a professional aide would cover 8 in the morning to 8 at night every day, and family members would split the overnight shifts between us. He pulled adaptive technology out of his bag, including a tablet Michaela could control with her eye movements, and a better speaking valve that worked more smoothly with her ventilator. He spent an hour showing us how to set up the eye gaze software and adjust the speaking valve. The garage started to feel slightly less like a hospital room, and more like a functional living space, with the medical equipment organized better, and the new technology making things feel less depressing. Royce also brought information about support groups for families dealing with paralysis, and a list of therapists who specialized in trauma. He left everything on the kitchen counter and told Dad to call him if we needed anything else. The next week, Anders came back with the approved remediation plan in a thick folder. He explained that a licensed contractor would install proper support beams upstairs to replace the one that collapsed, repair all the ceiling damage, and retrofit the structure to meet current building codes. The garage window would be brought up to code with proper framing and weatherproofing, so it was legal. The whole project would take 8 to 10 weeks and cost $82,000, which Dad said he was financing through a home equity loan. Anders walked through the permit process and inspection schedule, marking dates on a calendar he left with us. Dad signed all the forms right there at the kitchen table, his signature steady this time. I watched him initial each page and thought about how much money that was, how we'd be paying for Michaela's mistake for years. But at least we had a plan. At least things were moving forward instead of just sitting in this awful stuck place. A few days after that, a thick envelope arrived from the insurance company with their final decision letter. Dad opened it at the kitchen table while I made coffee, and I watched his face as he read. The letter confirmed that the structural damage claim was denied because of the intentional demolition and code violations, exactly like Mateo said at the meeting. But then Dad's expression changed slightly, and he kept reading. The insurance company was providing a $15,000 equipment stipend for Michaela's adaptive technology and home modifications to improve accessibility. It wasn't much compared to the $82,000 we'd lost, but Royce had said it would cover a ceiling lift system to help move Michaela and better ventilator equipment that was quieter and more reliable. Dad actually smiled a little bit reading that part, the first real smile I'd seen from him in weeks. He showed me the letter, and I felt this small flutter of hope, like maybe things could get slightly better, even if they'd never be good again. That weekend, I decided to reclaim a small piece of the garage for myself. I moved some of Michaela's medical equipment to one side and cleared out a corner near the window. I brought down the shelf Dad built for me years ago and set it up against the wall. On it, I placed the framed photos of Mom, the ones from our beach trip and her birthday dinner, and the silly selfie we took painting my old room pink. I added some of my favorite books, the worn copies of fantasy novels I'd read 100 times. It wasn't much, maybe 3 feet of space, but it felt like mine again. Michaela watched me through her eye gaze tablet, her eyes following my movements as I arranged everything. I walked over to her bed and told her I wasn't trying to take over her space, just claiming a tiny corner. Her eyes blinked twice, the signal we'd worked out for yes. The next day, I grabbed the nail polish collection from my bathroom and brought it to Michaela's bedside. I'd set up the projector on the wall earlier and queued up one of those mindless comedy movies we both used to watch. I pulled a chair close to her bed and took her hand, feeling the weight of it in mine, completely limp. She couldn't feel my fingers on hers, but she could see everything in the mirror positioned above her bed. I held up 3 bottles and she moved her eyes to pick the pale blue. I painted each nail slowly, carefully, wiping away the mistakes with remover. The movie played in the background, but neither of us really watched it. When I finished her left hand, I moved to her right, choosing a sparkly silver this time because her eyes landed on it. We didn't talk much, just existed in the same space without anger or blame hanging between us. It felt like the first peaceful moment we'd shared in months. Through her speaking valve, Michaela's voice came out thin and mechanical. She told me she wanted the attention and admiration my garage room got. She said she felt invisible in the family and thought a dramatic room transformation would make her special. The words came slowly, each breath regulated by the ventilator. She said she didn't mean for things to end up like this, but she stopped short of actually apologizing. I put down the nail polish and looked at her reflection in the mirror. I told her I knew she felt invisible, that I was sorry she felt that way. But what happened wasn't my fault. I said I understood wanting to feel special and wanting people to notice her. But I also said she made her own choices that day with the sledgehammer, and I couldn't take responsibility for those choices. I explained that I would help take care of her because she was family, but I couldn't fix the past. I said we both had to live with what happened now, and the only way forward was being honest about what we could and couldn't give each other. She blinked slowly, and I thought maybe she understood even if she couldn't fully accept it yet. Dad started acting different after the insurance letter arrived. He bought a huge wall calendar and hung it in the kitchen, the kind with big squares for each day. He spent an entire evening filling it in with different colored markers. Blue for nursing shifts, green for Michaela's therapy appointments, red for permit inspections, purple for my school schedule. Seeing everything laid out visually seemed to calm everyone down. We knew who was responsible for what and when. Adriana actually came into the kitchen while Dad was working on it and suggested moving my dentist appointment so it didn't conflict with Michaela's physical therapy. Dad added her suggestion and thanked her. She offered to handle the morning nursing coordination if Dad managed the evening shifts. It wasn't warm or friendly, but it was the first time I'd seen them work together on something in weeks. 2 months after the big meeting at the police station, the contractor finished the first major milestone. The new support beams were installed upstairs, and the ceiling was structurally sound again. Anders came to inspect the work, walking through the sealed-off area with his clipboard and measuring tools. He spent an hour checking everything before coming downstairs to tell us the work passed inspection. He said because we were in active compliance with the remediation plan, he was reducing our remaining fines to $1,500. Dad actually framed the inspection approval certificate like it was a diploma and hung it in the hallway. I understood why when I saw him looking at it later that night. It was proof we were fixing things. Proof we were moving forward instead of just drowning in the disaster. I started researching colleges during my lunch periods at the school. I looked up programs with strong disability support services, places that could help me understand what Michaela was going through. I narrowed it down to schools within an hour of home so I could still help with her care while building my own life. Dad found me at the kitchen table one night, surrounded by printouts, and helped me fill out the applications. He read through my essay about family challenges and said he was proud of me for not giving up on my future despite everything. I realized while we worked together that I could be part of this family and still have boundaries, still have my own goals and dreams. 3 months after the collapse, our house settled into a rhythm that felt almost normal on good days. Michaela had a functioning care routine with the nursing aide covering most of the day and family members splitting the night shifts. The upstairs repairs were 60% complete, the contractor showing up every weekday to work on the ceiling and walls. Money was tight and would be for years, the home equity loan payment showing up on Dad's bank statement every month. Family relationships were still fragile, conversations between Adriana and Dad still careful and formal. But we had systems in place and everyone was trying in their own way. Michaela would always be paralyzed, always need the ventilator and feeding tube and round-the-clock care. Some days were harder than others, days when the reality of what happened crashed down on all of us. But we were all still here, still trying, still figuring out how to live with the consequences of choices made in anger and fear and desperation. There were no heroes or villains in this story, just people learning to exist together in a situation nobody wanted.